Coming to you from his downtown Denver studio, here's the Backstage Jazz radio show with your host, Steve Roby.
Charles Burrell is a classical and jazz bass player and best known for being the first African-American to be signed to a full-time contract in a major symphony orchestra in the United States. He is often called the Jackie Robinson of classical music for this accomplishment. My guest today is Purnell Steen, a 5 Points ambassador who for the past 30 years has dedicated his efforts to preserving and playing the jazz and blues music of Denver's legendary 5 Points neighborhood. At Dazzle in downtown Denver, he and other musicians will honor Mr. Burrell's 103rd birthday on Friday, October 6th. Welcome to Backstage Jazz, Purnell.
Oh, welcome, Steve Roby. I'm so absolutely thrilled to be able to do this on September the 20th, 2023.
Great. It's a pleasure having you on the show and be able to talk to such a legend as yourself, too. Could you give our listeners a brief overview of your career and how you became a 5 Points ambassador?
Well, I'm a native Denverite, and I started piano 2 weeks before my 4th birthday. My parents, for Christmas I'm 82 years old. At Christmas of 1943, my parents gave me Christmas of 1944. My parents gave me a little toy piano, a la Schroeder from Peanuts.
Right.
And so I have cognitive remembrance, Steve, back to the age of 3. And so I can remember sitting on the floor. My mother had an old-fashioned Singer sewing machine, and I could see her feet on the treadle. And she was listening to the music of the day, which was basically the top 40 band hits. And by the way, incidentally, this was an all wooden piano, and the black keys were painted on the piano. So I kept trying to follow the tunes on the melody line. And when I couldn't identify a note that matched them, my mom said I would just sit there and howl and howl and howl. Well, fast forwarding, contacted our church organist who taught children. And our church organist said, Mrs. Steen, I don't take children until they're 5. My mother said I will not live that long. So I started off, my parents did not listen to blues music. So the classical music bug bit me, and it really bit me hard. When I was 8, Charles Burrell came to Denver, Colorado. And I was there for 74 years ago this month when he made his world famous debut. And I was still deeply, deeply immersed in classical music. He kept on studying. And Charlie took me to hear one of my very first jazz gigs, personally, to a place called the Piano Lounge, which was on 15th and Curtis, right across the street from the Woolworths. And he brought this man. It was 1951. 52. I was 11 years old. And Charlie called my mother, she was a cateress and a great cook. And Charlie brought this musician over, this pianist, who sat down at our dinner table and he ate. He was 5 feet 3 inches tall. I was almost as tall as he. And then he sat down at my piano and he played, and he played music. I had never heard the piano played like that.
Wow.
And they had a week-long gig, and so he came over and ate every night with us. It was Errol Garner.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And that was really the first time I ever saw jazz music, up close in front. And I did not know what he was doing. I couldn't identify it because I was still playing classical music. Well, I wanted to. I applied to several music schools, and this was in 1959 when I graduated from high school. And when they saw my color, they said, "Well, we're full up now. As soon as we get an opening, we will admit you. We loved your audition, yada yada yada." Well, guess what, Steve? 64 years later, I still have not gotten that letter.
Oh, jeez.
So, I really didn't toy with jazz. I was inducted to the United States Army. I left Vietnam, and I ended up in Germany with the 7th Army Soldiers Chorus. And my best friend in the world George Morrison Bailey, who is a grandson of the legendary Denver's legendary George Morrison. He and I were born on the same date, 3 years apart, tax day, by the way. And George Bailey started doing these riffs on chords on and things, and I just kind of followed his hands. And when I got back to the United States, I just started tinkling around and toying around. And Charles was there to kind of, give me some pointers. I didn't formally study jazz. He did get me in 1956. I started with Ted Alexander, who was one of the great legendary musicians of this era and area, who was Bill Evans's roommate in New York. So I studied personally with Ted. When the oil business collapsed in 1981, I had to go to work. So I got a job. Charlie got me a job on Larimer Square as a cocktail lounge pianist. And that man, he's so wise, and he one of the greatest teachers on a human, very, very humanistic basis, one-to-one. He told me, he said, learn a song. He said, you have great musical ears. Learn 4 songs a night. I had to play, 3 nonstop hours. And he said, just think about that. You learn 4 songs a night, and 5 days you have 20 songs. At the end of the month, you have 100. So I have a very, very vast repertoire.
Wow.
And I got a call from National Jewish Hospital. They wanted to do a fundraiser. Somebody heard about me and said, would you bring your trio down to Larimer Square to help us raise money for National Jewish Hospital? I said, yes. Steve, that was a phantom trio. I didn't have one. So I hastily hired a bass player and a drummer, and we stepped out on blind, absolute, incredulously naive faith.
Wow.
And they said, what's the name of it? I said, I don't know, Purnell Steen Trio. And then pretty soon I started getting more gigs. And then literally about 25, just after the turn of the century, I had some medical issues, and I was getting out of the hospital, and somebody said, I need you for an engagement. I said, sure. And they said, well, what's the name of the band? And I said, I don't know. I said, you know what? I said, Purnell Steen, because I'll be signing the checks, and La Jazz Machine. I said, because a machine is the sum of its parts. So we did that for quite a while. And then during the pandemic, Sister Cities International had us do a live streaming video from Dazzle. It was closed, because of the pandemic.
Sure.
So people were regaling. The Denver Sister Cities organization was there, and the chairman of the Brest, France committee was there. Brest, France is Denver's oldest sister city in seniority since 1948. So they were touting all this connection of Brest to Denver, and the Brestois citizens had been here, and they were well aware of 5 Points, and they came here and they did some mural painting in and around 5 Points. And so as people were touting, what the Brestois had done, I'm very shy, as you can tell, Steve. I said, well, excuse me, why don't you send my band to Europe as the 5 Points ambassadors? Suddenly you could have heard a pin hit a pad of cotton. It got deathly, ethereally quiet. And somebody said, that's the best idea I've ever heard. The next morning, I had to get online and contact Jenna Griswold's office. She's the Secretary of State, and register the name with the state of Colorado.
Really? Wow.
So, yes, so that's literally how we became the 5 Points ambassadors. But prior to that, I had always, if you go to my website, purnellsteenmusic.com, on the main page, there is someone it was taken at the 5 Points Jazz Festival. I think it was 2012, possibly 2011, 2012. And Myra Warren, who is our wonderful vocalist, is on the stage. And she said, I went to New York as a young person And she said, when I went to New York some 25, 30 years ago prior to this, she said, people asked me if I had ever been to Five Points, Colorado. And that stays up on my website as if it were a city of its own. And truly, Steve, and I do lectures on the history of Denver and the history of Five Points. And when I preface my lectures, I always say, East Denver, quote, East Denver, which was Negro Denver, was like it was its own community. I said, you know what? It was analogous to the legendary community in the Andy Griffith Show. We had every infrastructural institution there, which made it its own self-contained city. And so we would go to Five Points, and then we would go Welton Street, which was the hub, the main quote, the main drag of Five Points, was the main street, and so it was a place of honor to go. And people would say, "Hey, I'm going to the Points to get my haircut," or we call it the Points. Going to the Points to get with ladies say, "I'm going to the beauty parlor on the Points," or "I'm going to go see Dr. Owen Clarence Holmes, who was a wonderful dentist, one of the founders of the NAACP in 1909." I said, "I'm going to the dentist to see Dr. Holmes." So we had all that infrastructure, and then there were the clubs. There was a world famous Rossonian, and then there was the Rice's Tap Room. There was a Porters and Waiters Club. There was a Cleft Club, to name but a few. And then in the 40s, there was the Ritz Cafe. East Denver had two cab companies that were owned by two Black women.
Really?
One of whom
Wow.
was Mrs. Ida Lewis, who owned the Ritz Cafe, along with the Ritz Cab. And when people went to the after hours club, I'm going to get to that in a minute, people would play, the musicians would play until sunup. And they said, let's go get some grits at the Ritz. And Charles Burrell had a house band at the after hours club, which at that time was called Lil's, because Lil had a program, jazz program on the radio. Charlie had. And when I was a teenager, Charles has two stepsons. So 1957, 58, I'd go to Lil's and they'd let us in. They said, "Oh, that's Mr. Burrell's boys. Let them in there. You better let them in." So we would go in underage. They knew we were underage. We went in basically to listen to the music.
Nice.
And I'll tell you what, Steve, have you ever heard this statement that Five Points is the Harlem of the West?
Yes, I asked you that back at the Five Points Jazz Festival this June, and you gave me a great answer, and I'd love you to share that with my listeners.
I'm going to do that. Well, we would go there, and there was this guy, this white guy, who was always 4.5 sheets to the wind, and he was he was stewed. He was always so happy. He was, "Oh man," and he was very boisterous. "Oh man, and this is the best music." And of course, his language was so peppery, I cannot, use that on the airwaves. And it was very, very well laced with some Anglo-Saxon expletives. And he said, "Oh man, this is the best music." And he kept saying, and he was writing all the time. He kept writing. And if he ran out of stuff in his notebook, he'd go to the restroom. Next thing you know, he was writing on paper towels. And so finally he said, "This is the Harlem of the West." Oh man. And it was Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
Saw him with these beady little eyes. We did not know who he was, but he was, he always enjoyed the music, and that was the spirit of love and camaraderie, and some of the greatest musicians would come through Denver, and when they did, if they were at the Rossonian, they would go 4 blocks down north on Welton to what was then called Lil's Club, which became after that became Mr. Green's. And they would play and play and play until they just, couldn't play anymore and go to their hotels or their lodgings. And if they had a prolonged gig here, it was just like a cycle. And then also Denver Five Points was home of the legendary pig ear sandwich, right there at what became Zona's, right across the street from the main entrance of the Rossonian. Well, one thing, the great thing is it was a boiled pig ear with on a bun with onions, chopped onions, and mustard. And at the time, they were a quarter. And they were so legendarily famous. I don't know if I told you that one of my cousins is the world famous legendary blues singer, alto sax player Eddie Clean Ed Vinson.
Right, yeah.
My mother raised, it was really funny. My mother raised Clean Ed in Houston, Texas, and Clean Ed's wife, Bernice, whose nickname was Totsy, that was a family nickname, was related to my mother on her paternal side of the family. My grandmother was a Burrell, and my grandfather's name was McGruder. So anyway, my mother was related to Cleanhead's wife through her dad, and to him through the Burrells. And, and all people such as that, of that caliber, would come through. Harry Sweets Edison. And then Jimmy Lunsford had a great band. Jimmy Lunsford lived here in Denver, Colorado. Jimmy Lunsford was in George Morrison's band, and Jimmy Lunsford broke off and started his own band. His band was so elegant that many times on the air, he and his band were mistaken for Duke Ellington.
Really? Wow.
And speaking of Duke Ellington, I did not mention, truly, Denver's, I would say, the father of jazz in the Rocky Mountain West has to be Mr. George Morrison. George Morrison was born in Missouri in Boulder in the late 1880s. His father was a classically trained violinist. However, his dad played on the Pantages vaudeville circuit. There was the Ziegfeld circuit and then the Pantages, with Pantages Theater. So anyway, Mr. Morrison, George Morrison, was classically trained, was trained as a violinist by his father. And he could not get, when the Denver Symphony, the first iteration of the Denver Symphony, it was the Denver Civic Orchestra, was founded 100 years ago next year, as a matter of fact. They turned him down, he being George Morrison. So he said, forget it. And he realized that he could make more money as a band leader, and they had in those days what were called territory bands, and they were based on geography. Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and the surrounding states bordering Colorado. Because think about this: this was pre-radio. First radio station was licensed, I believe, in 1927. So we're talking about 1920, 21. So there was no source of entertainment. And so they would go to the mining camps here in Colorado, especially, and they would bring this music, to the mining camps within a territorial basis. In 1923, 100 years ago, George Morrison, by the way, whose home is at 2558 Gilpin Street, just south of Manual High School on the corner of 26th and Gilpin. George Morrison took his 22-piece band to London. Can you imagine? It took 4.5 days to get from Denver by train to New York.
Wow.
And then probably about a week to 10 days, because in those days, steamers didn't probably, they had probably a top speed of about 15 miles an hour, nautical miles an hour. So then they got to Great Britain. George Morrison was under contract to Columbia Records in the 1920s. And they did a Royal Command performance for King George V, who was the grandfather of the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth.
Right. Wow. That's
interestingly enough, no pictures of the band.
Oh.
There were banner headlines. George Morrison takes London by storm, but there were no accompanying pictures.
Jeez.
And the reason why I know this so well, Mr. Morrison was my surrogate grandfather. I called him Big Daddy, as did all of his grandchildren, because my grandfather died before I was born. Both of them did. So he told me these stories personally, Steve. So, this is straight out of the proverbial horse's mouth.
Mm.
So he had a vocalist with him. And when they came back from this tour and they had lots of gigs to do, um, his vocalist left. She said she was tired of being the only female amongst these knuckleheads. And it was very daunting. And here these guys were full of testosterone, and there she was. And she wasn't taking any nonsense. Well, she went to Hollywood. By the way, she attended East High School, which is my alumnus school. And she went to Hollywood and she started working and she got into the movie industry. And in 1939, she changed the landscape of Hollywood and the Oscars forever because she got the Oscar for the best supporting role in Gone with the Wind. And I'm speaking of the legendary Hattie McDaniel.
Yes, yes.
And Hattie McDaniel went to East High School, I think it was 1908 through 1911.
I always learn so much when we meet and talk, Purnell. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So anyway, so that's how I kind of do the history, and then I just developed my jazz more or less because of Charles Burrell, who mentored my life.
Nice. I'm going to play a short clip right now of Mr. Burrell reflecting on his life as a musician, and after that, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about his career in music.
When I came through, I was exposed to the giants of the swing era. Okay, the Duke Ellingtons, Count Basie, Earl Father Hines, Nellie Lutcher, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald. There's not too many I didn't play with, really.
Charlie Burrell was called the Jackie Robinson of the classical world. When he was hired by the Denver Symphony in 1949, he became the first black symphonic musician in the United States.
I had always wanted to come to Denver, and because my mother was born here, and her name is Denver Rado, R-A-D-O, Denver Arado. That was her name. If it hadn't been for playing jazz, I could never have been a classical musician. One of the reasons why I chose the classics, after a while I realized that was my people, the black musicians in that day, had no place to play but the joints. The doors were all closed because there was no blacks in the classics then, okay? None, absolutely none.
A generation earlier, classically trained violinist George Morrison was told that he'd be hired if he were white. So George Morrison took up jazz.
He was the first. He started something, okay? He started the dynasty of jazz. He made it possible. He was the godfather of jazz in this area.
Arguably, George Morrison was Colorado's most celebrated violinist, an arranger, composer, band leader, club owner, and music teacher. In 1941, Downbeat magazine called him the best musician west of KC.
If you're just joining us, my guest today is musician Purnell Steen, who has organized a birthday tribute to Charles Burrell at Dazzle. Purnell, can you elaborate a little bit more on Mr. Burrell's music career and why he is so important, not only to Denver's musical jazz history, but to the United States and as an African American, his importance?
Well, Charles was born in Toledo, Ohio on October 4th, 1920. And fast forwarding, he was one of 7 children. And in 1932, he and his brother Joe, who was a year younger than he, built a very primitive radio. It was called a crystal set. And Charles started listening to music, and he heard this wonderful piece of music. Little did he know he was listening to. He said to his brother Joe, "I want to be in that band." Little did he know he was listening to the venerable San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, which was being conducted by Pierre Monteux. So fast forwarding, Charles studied. His first instrument was, he played the tuba, and then in junior high school, his music teacher offered him an instrument. Have you ever seen a metal bass, contrabass? It was aluminum, I guess. And that's what he was given to play in his junior high school orchestra.
Wow.
So Charles had to get a little red wagon because this thing was so, it was so big. He had to haul it back and forth to school.
Oh my
God. Yes. Well, he went to a school, the legendary Cass Tech School, which is a technical school in Detroit. The anomalous situation exists within the music department because the faculty of the music department is comprised of members of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So Charles excelled under this at that school, and as a high school kid, he was given, and all of the students in the music department, they were given the equivalent of a college music education from a conservatory. So he went to Wayne State University at the age of 16 and was studying. And Gaston Brohan, who was head of the music department, said, "You know what? We'll let you study this as long as you don't play the classics." So they let him study, and they deliberately mistaught him and trying to derail his interest in music. But he did not let that deter him. And so he graduated when he was 19 in 1939 from Wayne State University, and he got some pennies together and was able to spend the summer at the revered New England Conservatory in Boston, where the professor, whose name I've forgotten, retaught Charlie. He said, "Wait, you've been mistaught. Let me reteach you," which he did. And then Charles went into the Navy and spent his World War II career at the Great Lakes Naval Air Station in Waukegan, Illinois, which was segregated. Roberts Falls was for the Negroes. Charles was in the Navy with the legendary Clark. Good Lord, why am I blanking? Clark Terry.
There you go.
Clark Terry and Al Gray. Al Gray as a trumpeter, of course. Clark's as a trombonist. I'm sorry. Clark is a legendary trumpeter and flugelhornist. The only thing they did in the morning, they played reveille. In the afternoon, they played taps. They got on the train and commuted from Waukegan to Chicago, where they played the jazz and blues. Well, after the war, Charles he was honorably discharged. He went back to Detroit, and he saw that there was no future for him in music. He came here to Denver because his mother's family, that was the Howard family, his mother's family, consisting of 3 aunts and an uncle, were here in Denver. So he came here to Denver, used his GI Bill, and got a job at Fitzsimmons Hospital as a janitor. And Steve, in those days, streetcar ran all the way out in the country to Fairmont, to the hospital. One day coming back, Charles got on the streetcar and he saw this man who was carrying this funny looking case. And Charles had the temerity to ask him if this weren't a case, a bow case for a contrabass. And this man said, "Yes, how do you know?" And Charlie said, "Well, I play one. I play it." And they started talking. He told this man that he had a degree in, gotten a degree in music from Wayne State University, and in musical studies and bass studies. And it was providential. That man happened to be James Van Buskirk, who was the principal bassist of the then Denver Symphony Orchestra.
Ah.
And he told Charlie, he said, "By the way, we're looking for a bass player." So Charlie, they arranged an audition for Charles. This was in 1949. And Charlie told me, I said, "How long was the audition?" He said, "Hours long." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Mostly a lot of conversation." I said, "But what did you do musically?" He said, "Oh, Saul Caston, who was the maestro, the conductor, who conducted the interview and audition, said he wanted Charles to play a 2-octave G major scale with whole notes." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." And that was the extent of his musical portion of his audition. And then my mother and I were there the night Charlie came by. He was very excited, told my mother, whose name was Laverne, he said, "I'm going to be playing with the symphony." Well, I was already a very pretentious 9-year-old, 8-year-old symphony nerd.
Uh-huh.
I'd gone to the symphony when I was 5. So my mother and I went to the symphony, and I saw all the musicians tuning up. I didn't see any Charles. I said to my mom, "Where's Charlie?" And, 8-year-olds can be very emotional. And she
Right.
said, "Well, he's coming." I said, "I don't see him, Mom." I said, they're all out there. And she said, he promised. I said, "He promised me." She said, "He is coming pretty soon." Steve, the door to the stage opened, and there was the contrabass, the double bass, framed in the doorway, and it did not move. To me, it seemed as though it were an eternity, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, I don't know. And then finally, the bass was suspended in the air in the door frame, and then all of a sudden, the bass started moving across the stage, and there was Charles Burrell, ramrod straight, all 5 feet 9 inches of him in his tails, with that great military bearing, carrying that bass as if he were going to war, because he had to pick it up off the stage because he was so short. And all of a sudden, when people recognized, some people, there was tepid applause, and it's still 74 years later rings in my ears. "Oh my God!" Somebody yelled out, "They've hired a nigger. What is going to happen next?" Oh yes. Oh, yes. There were people who did give a modicum, some rather tepid applause. There were 2 or 3 who maybe very, 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 gave some large, major applause, but people were kind of stunned. I got here the intake of the breath. And Charles had to cross that stage by himself with that bass to get to the bass section at the Auditorium Theater. And by the way, that is a wonderful preface to what I want to say next.
Okay.
Von Regensberger, who is one of the 5 Points ambassadors, I have 2 guitarists in my band. He is a Brazilian guitarist, plays Brazilian guitar, has composed Brazilian music, has recorded Brazilian music in Rio with some of the great Brazilian players. And also he is a world-class filmmaker who had written the book for and directed 4 award-winning full-length films, which were filmed here in Denver. And he and I started on February the 10th. No, I'm sorry, February the 11th, 2019. And every day we had a prayer. We started interviewing Charles. Every day we had a prayer. "Lord, let Charles live." we finalized a documentary film entitled The Longest Walk. It's 95 minutes long. It took us 3 years to do. It is available on Amazon Prime and also on Tubi, those streaming platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And you can rent it or you can buy it.
Yeah.
And when we did the world premiere screening, in fact, last year on today's date, we were in Brest, France. The ambassadors, the city of Denver, and the Denver Sister Cities International raised money and sent 5 of us to Brest for a week. And we did the premiere showing of this film in Brest. And when people saw it, we were in the theater, and we did the talk back afterwards, keeping in mind that if I spoke French, I would wreck Franco. The last 200 years of Franco-American relations would go down the drain. My French is abysmal, but the people came out with tears in their eyes, saying, "Oh my God, they did not know." I'm going to also fast forward. The world's greatest bass player, Mr. Ron Carter, was here at Dazzle last week.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see him, and somebody said, "Purnell, why don't you have Dazzle see to it that Ron Carter, Mr. Carter, is taken over to see Charlie. Charlie resides at Brookdale at Lowry." And I said, well, that's Dazzle. They said, "Why don't you do it?" I said, "I don't work for Dazzle." Well, I got into the mix. And surely enough, Steve, Vaughn and I were able to do this. And so I took, he by the way, Mr. Carter tangentially knew of Charles. He knew that Charles was Diane Reeves' uncle, and also that he was George Duke's cousin, as we are, and that he had taught George Duke in San Francisco at the San Francisco Conservatory. But when I said to Mr. Carter, I started verbalizing what I just told you. Mr. Carter said to me, "Go over and tell Russell," that was as in Russell Malone. He said, "You tell Russell, you and Russell work it out." Mr. Carter's 86 years old. Russell is 59. So, of course. So I went back over to Dazzle where Russell Malone was sitting having a glass of water. I told him that, and he said, out of reverence, he calls Mr. Carter Pop. He said, "Pop does this all the time." Well, we took Pop, Mr. Carter, and Russell over to see Charlie last Thursday. And the history was made that day, Steve, because Charles is in a wheelchair. So when they brought him into the library, we were sequestered by ourselves. We started talking. They started talking. And I made one reference to something that Charles had accomplished. And there's a wonderful picture of them with Mr. Carter's hands on top of Charles's hands. And Russell Malone said to me, "Mr. Steen, this is a defining moment in history. These are the 2 greatest bass players in the world." He said, Mr. Burrell walked up the steps and opened that door by himself so that Pop and others could walk through and follow.
Wow. That's a great story.
Yes, and we have this wonderful picture of Mr. Ron Carter encapsulating Charles's hands with his.
Nice.
And so this was the last night of their 3-day gig, and so Mr. Carter said to Charles, he said, "You're coming to the show tonight?" And Charlie said, "I wasn't invited." And he said, "Well, you will get in." And then Mr. Carter looked at my colleague Von Regensberger and me and said, "Are you 2 coming?" And we said, Von said, "Well, Mr. Carter, it is sold out. We can't get in." He said, "You will get in." Just like that.
Nice.
Yes.
That's one.
And, and the people whom I computed a long time ago because of his symphony contract. See, he did 10 years here with the symphony. In 1959, he got called to go to the San Francisco Symphony, which was world famous. And when he went, he was very well received. The board of the symphony called Pierre Monteau out of retirement. Pierre Monteau conducted the debut concert of Mr. Charles Burrell with them in 1959, and he conducted the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony, and that was the piece of music that Charles Burrell had heard 27 years earlier. And he said that was the greatest, that was the pinnacle of his career, was to walk out on that stage and play for his idol. And he said it was so nice. He said in his very humble way, Steve, he said, Mr. Monteau was so nice. He took me out for lunch, and it was just me, him, and his little dog. And I've often said, when he had these milestone events in his life, when he turned 90, and then his centennial birthday, because of the pandemic 3 years ago, there were 103 cars in a wonderful cavalcade who paraded in front of Charlie at Brookdale.
Nice. Wow.
Yes. And that day I was interviewed by Comcast. I said, Charles Burrell has redefined dignity. I said, through his humility, he has redefined dignity. And he's always said to people, just call me Charlie. He's never been Mr. Burrell. And that's what he said, hey, I'm Charlie. And so, he's mentored me, as I said, when he went to San Francisco. He was one of the first African Americans on the prestigious San Francisco conservatory faculty. Our cousin George Duke, who was a prodigy, was accepted to the conservatory in 1959 when he was 13 years old.
Jeez. Wow.
And he graduated when he was 16 years old. See, Charles's, my mother and George Duke's mother were all first cousins.
It's amazing how everything connects there. Yeah. Hey,
yes.
Let's play some music now.
Sounds good.
You turned me on to Tad Wheeler and his recording studio, and he has digitized a rare 1979 recording of Mr. Burrell performing with pianist Louise Duncan at Charlie O's Supper Club. And on side one, there's a track that stood out for me. I think it will for everybody else, of the classic Satin Doll. Do you have any few comments about this recording?
Yes, I do. The main thing that no one told you, these are all live takes. They were done in people's homes or Charlie O's at various clubs, and there was a performance, and it was just recorded. It was not done in a recording studio.
The quality is great, though.
Yeah, absolutely. It was done. The recording was done by Hugh Grant, who is the head of the Vance Kirkland Museum, and Hugh recorded all of these by himself, and the quality is exquisite. The one amazing thing about Louise Duncan is that she could not read music.
Really?
And once you play it, I have a Louise Duncan first, shall we?
I lost you there for a second. Okay, could you repeat that again? There was a blank spot there.
Oh yes, I said I would welcome giving you a Louise Duncan story. However, I would love to hear Louise and Charlie play first.
Okay, let's listen to that now. That's this is Satin Doll with Mr. Burrell performing with pianist Louise Duncan at Charlie O's Supper Club. And we're back on Backstage Jazz with my guest today, Purnell Steen. Let's talk about the upcoming Burrell birthday tribute at Dazzle. I understand it has an early start time and you'll be playing with other musicians. Please tell me more.
I'll tell you what, I have had an ongoing house quote gig. I've been blessed to have a house gig with Dazzle for the last 8 or 9 years. I started off and actually 10 years. I started off at the old Dazzle on 9th. And then when June 1st, 2017, they opened up at Bowers on Curtis. And I did a gig there called Pancakes with Purnell. After the pandemic, we started doing the Lunch Bunch. So this is an iteration of the Lunch Bunch. We will be there every first Friday throughout until the end of the year. And I have sent out a clarion call. My band, the Ambassadors, will be there, and we are sending out a clarion call to any musician who would like to drop in and play a tune for Charlie. They're most welcome. I know the first taker was Greg Gisbert. So Greg will be Gizzy I call him Gizzy Gisbert, and he said, "Mr. Steen, I love that. I'll take that." I said, "Okay." So Gizzy will be there, and I'll have my band, Derek Bannock, Carlos Chavez on oh good Lord, saxophone. I'll have a guest, Mark Diamond, on bass, and Bill Larson on set. Bon Regensberger on one guitar, and Ed Steven on the other guitar, and myself on piano, and various and sundry guests from the community. And they all want to come by and say hello to Charlie, a man most deserving of anything he gets, because he's been so gracious and he's mentored so many people.
This sounds like a wonderful event. Let me remind our listeners the details. Charlie Burrell's 103rd birthday tribute will occur at Dazzle on Friday, October 6th at 11 a.m. with doors opening at 10 a.m. I suggest you get there early. Sounds like it's going to be a great show. Tickets are available now at dazzledenver.com.
May I add one more thing, please for Charles?
Please.
There will be a special screening of our movie, The Longest Walk, Thursday evening at East High School in Denver, Colorado. And it starts at 7. The tickets are very, very cheap. And the purpose of this is to support the East High School music department and the kids who so desperately need all kinds of mentorship. And Charlie he may be there. We have the film there. And thank you for letting me do this. And once again, Steve, it's been my consummate pleasure. Can you get there Friday, Steve?
Oh, I'll bring my camera. How's that?
Sounds good. Okay.
Before I let you go, why don't you repeat your website info so people that want to contact you and learn more about Charlie and 5 Points and everything else?
Okay, yes. My website is purnellsteenmusic.com. And there's lots of contact information. Also, by the way, one of the very last performances Charlie did, we were at Dazzle. He was 96 years old, and I keep that up on my website because this was one of the lunches, and there's a 96-year-old man tearing up the bass plate, on my website. And God bless you, and thank you so very much for doing this wonderful, great community service. And hey, everybody in Charlie Land, ha ha ha. Thank you very much. This is Purnell Steen.
Thank you so much, Purnell. And thanks for honoring this great musician, Charlie Burrell.
You're so welcome. And thank you, Steve. See you on the 6th.
If you're enjoying the Backstage Jazz Show, we'd love for you to like, subscribe, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Backstage Jazz can also be heard on Tavern Radio at tavn.org. And now, back to the show.
The Backstage Jazz Show was recorded at Little Raven Studios in downtown Denver, and our producer was Craig Stevens. You can find Backstage Jazz wherever you listen to podcasts and on the Tavern Radio Network, which you can find at tavn.org. Be sure to stop by our website, backstage-jazz.com, where all past and current episodes have been archived. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, you can email us at backstagejazz@fastmail.com. This is Steve Roby. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Backstage Jazz.
You've been listening to the Backstage Jazz Show on the Arts Validation Network. Join us next time for more great jazz and interviews with your favorite musicians.